Dr. Lou A. DiMarco retired as a lieutenant colonel in the United States Army in 2005 after more than 24 years of active service as an armored cavalry officer. His military assignments include Cavalry Troop Command, instructor at the U.S. Army Armor School, and staff assignments at all levels from division through joint headquarters. He has written and lectured on a variety of military affairs topics, including military government and civil affairs, armored cavalry and reconnaissance, urban warfare, and counterinsurgency. His work has been published by the Association of the U.S. Army, the Combat Studies Institute, and a variety of professional journals, including Armor, Military Review, Proceedings, Parameters, and the Global War Studies Journal. He is also the author of the booklet Military Operations and the Middle Eastern City, and 2 books, War Horse, A History of the Military Horse and Rider, and Concrete Hell, Modern Urban Operations from Stalingrad to Iraq, which is listed on the Army Chief of Staff's professional reading list and is considered a seminal work on the subject. Dr. DiMarco is married to retired Army Colonel Joyce DiMarco, who teaches leadership at the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College, and they have 2 daughters, both serving in the military. He lives on a 56-acre farm in Leavenworth County, Kansas, with Joyce, 4 dogs, 4 horses, and a John Deere tractor. And now, without any more delay, please help me in welcoming Dr. Lou DiMarco.
Well, thank you. It's my pleasure to be here tonight. A lot of information to cover regarding Italy and World War I, and in particular the Italian Army. Some of it's political, some of it's cultural, and a good bit of it's military. And I'm going to try to get through it in about 45 minutes. About 3 years of real intense history, and really about 40 years of history in 45 minutes. A little bit of a challenge, but I think we can do it. I have a personal interest in the Italian front in World War II. Here you see 2 pictures. On the left, Americo and Alfonso DiMarco. Americo's my grandfather, and Alfonso's his brother. They immigrated to the U.S. in 1908, worked in the coal mines in Pennsylvania for about 6 years. In 1915, late 1914, 1915, they went back to Italy, joined the Italian Army, and they spent World War I in the Italian Army on the Italian front that we're going to talk about today. Both of them survived the war. Alfonso stayed in Italy, and his branch of the DiMarco family, I visit regularly. I was in Italy 2 years ago and spent 2 weeks with my cousins in Aquila. My grandfather came back to the U.S. in 1919, went back to Italy in 1928, got married. My dad was born in Italy in 1930 and came to the States with my grandmother and spent the rest of his life until he joined the service in Brooklyn, New York. Originally, that's kind of where we're from, the DiMarcos on the East Coast, but not too many of us left there anymore. On the right side of the screen, you see my other grandfather, Jakob Sononer, my mom's dad. He's Austrian, corporal in the Austrian Army, also served on the Italian front. Sometime we think, we're not real positive, but we think in 1917 he was severely wounded. We're not exactly sure how, either a bullet or shrapnel in the face, penetrated both cheeks, broke his jaw, knocked out a bunch of teeth, and he was left on the battlefield unconscious for dead. And he came to regain consciousness as they were throwing him into a wagon that was collecting the dead bodies off of the battlefield. He couldn't talk because his jaw was broken, but he was able to signal the recovery people that he was still alive. They pulled him off. He spent the next 2 years in hospitals. And for the rest of his life, you see him in that picture. That picture was taken in Innsbruck, Austria in 1914. You see him in that picture, clean shaven. For the rest of his life, he had a very full beard because of the scarring that was left over from his wounds in World War I. And so through both branches of my family, I have a pretty personal connection to this part of the war. Interestingly enough, my mother's family, Austrians, after the war, and I'll talk about this a little bit later when we get to the end of the lecture, the part of Austria, Südtirol, southern Tyrol, was annexed to Italy after the war as a reward for being on the winning side. And so my mom's family, the Austrian Sononers, became Italian overnight. My mom was born in 1924, was raised in Italian schools and speaking German at home. And in 1936, a deal was cut between Hitler and Mussolini. And actually, the German government at the time had a policy of any German-speaking families who wanted to immigrate to Germany, the German government would pay for that. Italy's economy was not so great. Former Austrian soldiers who were now Italians were prohibited from having any job other than menial labor. And so my grandfather, who was an accountant by trade, was a street sweeper during the day, an accountant under the table at night. And he took the German government up on his family. He moved himself and his 8 kids from Italy to Germany. And then, just to complete the story, about 20 years later, 1957, my dad was in the Air Force, stationed at Ramstein Air Force Base. My mom was working for the Air Force as a German citizen now. And my uncle, who was in the Army, was also stationed in Germany, and they were in the post-exchange, and where my mom worked, speaking Italian as they went through the cashier's line about who was going to ask the cute cashier out for a date. And my mom, of course, whose Italian was better than anybody on the DiMarco side, understood every word. As it turned out, neither one of them asked her, so she asked them which one was going to take her out in perfect Italian. And a couple years later, I came along. So there's a pretty strong connection both to Italy, Austria, and I have a huge German family that lives in Germany, and we have distant relatives on the Sononer side who are still in Italy, Italian citizens. And in the mid-60s, 3 members of the Italian ski team were Sononers, distant cousins. And so World War I still has a connection, if you take the time to pull those strings, to the families in Europe, as it does to American families. So, Italy. What we're going to talk about is where the Italian army comes from, and part of that discussion will be where Italy comes from, because Italy is new on the scene, and really one of its first real international impacts is World War I. We're going to talk about the Triple Alliance. I'll explain a little bit more about that when we get into it. The organization and history of the Italian army, and then we'll get into the major battles and campaigns that take place on the Italian front. And then at the end, I'll suggest some conclusions for you, which you might not find in the normal history books regarding World War I, which tend to ignore Italy, tend to ignore the Italian front, and the potential impacts strategically that Italy had on the war. Okay, Italy is a relatively young country. In 1914, 1915, it was only unified completely in 1866. The Italian Wars of Unification begin in 1859, actually second attempt to unify the peninsula in 1859, and through a series of mostly political moves and some small battles, by 1866, the various provinces and kingdoms of the Italian peninsula were unified as the Kingdom of Italy. But this is what it looked like before unification. Very diverse culturally and also in terms of industry and agriculture. The southern part of the country very poor. The northern part of the country closely aligned with either French culture or German culture through Austria, Switzerland, and Germany, and really no real sense of being Italian in the country prior to 1866. The lead state in unifying Italy is the Kingdom of Sardinia. You can see the island of Sardinia, but most people don't realize that the real heart of the Kingdom of Sardinia was in what is today eastern France and northwestern Italy. And the Sardinian king was the driver of Italian unification, and slowly led by charismatic leaders like Garibaldi, one by one these various states came under the sway of the Sardinian king and his parliament. And in that process, Sardinia became not the Kingdom of Sardinia, but the Kingdom of Italy. The last parts of the puzzle come together in 1866 when Sicily, the Kingdom of Sicily, which includes most of southern Italy and the island of Sicily, are integrated into the kingdom. And then kind of another little known aspect of the history is that the papal states run by the Pope, pretty much they owned and governed and had their own army, and they owned most of central Italy. They are forced into the Kingdom of Italy by force, and there are various alliances with these small states. The southern Kingdom of Italy and the Papal States are closely associated with France. The northeastern states, the Republic of Venice, is actually part of the Habsburg Empire, so the Austrian emperor is the ruler there. And it is mostly through diplomatic maneuvering and a small use of force that these various diverse kingdoms are organized in Italy. But the point of this is that when this happens in 1866, you're 40 years away from the war. The country hasn't gelled yet, and to most Italians, 80% of the country by 1914 are still peasants. 80% of the peasants are illiterate, and so if they know anything about the world, it is about their province. And the idea of an Italian state is a foreign concept, really, to the generations that enter into World War I. The Italian army is built on the Sardinian Royal Army as its basis. And in the reorganization, in the unification of Italy, the lead military force is the Sardinian Royal Army. But as I indicated earlier, there's not much fighting that happens. The one significant battle where the Italians actually have to fight a modern peer army as part of the unification is in 1866, as they are trying to incorporate Venice and the Kingdom of Venice into the Kingdom of Italy. the Austrian, Venice belongs to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The Austrian army is positioned in Venice, and at the Battle of Custoza in 1866, the Italian Royal Army now is soundly defeated by the Austrians in the process of trying to incorporate Venice into the kingdom. That battle is part of a larger war that Austria is fighting with Prussia. The Austrians lose that war, and in the negotiations with the Prussians, who Italy had allied with, the Austrians are forced to give up Venice to the Kingdom of Italy, and that completes most of the establishment of the modern borders of Italy, at least the borders that will exist up until World War I. But the point there is that in the unification process, the one time that the Italian army meets a modern, another modern army on the field, they're beat, and they're beat pretty soundly. And so they start off without much of a record. Over the next 30 or 40 years, the Kingdom of England, or of Italy, is trying to establish itself as a member of the European community, and if it wants to be a serious member of the European community, it needs to have colonies like the big powers, especially France and England, but also to a lesser extent Germany. And so as they look around for where is land available to colonize, Italy has limited choices. And the choices come down to North Africa. Now, the British are in the Sudan, and the British are in Egypt. The French are in Tunisia and Morocco. So the Italians are left with the choice of what they call Eritrea, which is modern-day Somalia and Ethiopia, and Libya. And they use their army to move into those areas. For the next 30 years, they fight constant small, what we would call today counterinsurgency wars against the natives of Libya. And, but in Ethiopia, it's a different story, because the Ethiopians have a native army and a pretty well-established kingdom that the Italians coming through Somalia run into. And the Italians decide that their military can handle a native African army with no problem. And then in 1896, at the Battle of Adwa, an Italian force of about 17,000 runs into what they thought was an Ethiopian army of about 50,000. Turns out it's probably closer to 80,000 Ethiopians. But the Italians thought, hey, we're modern Europeans, and we have cannon and modern weapons and modern tactics, and handling a bunch of native troops is not going to be a problem. Unfortunately, it was. And the Italian army, in its second large-scale battle in its short history, this time against the native Ethiopians, is soundly defeated again. 17,000-man force, 4 brigades of Italian troops is all but wiped out. About 7,000 of the 17,000 escape. The rest mostly are killed or captured by the Ethiopians. And the Italians are forced to recognize basically the sovereignty of Ethiopia and withdraw and limit their colonial ambitions. And in kind of the culture of Italy, those people who are interested in military affairs are beginning to realize that maybe the Italian army isn't so good. And within the Italian army, they've got a chip on their shoulder, because the rest of Europe is kind of thinking, the Italians aren't so good. And in this race for trying to establish themselves as part of modern Western Europe, they're coming up short. And they're running into the European powers, the other European powers, who are basically pushing them around. There's no love lost between them and the Austrians. because the Austrians, had to give up Venice, but there's still huge, significant parts of the Austro-Hungarian Empire that are Italian-speaking, that are not part of the kingdom, and the kingdom would like to get them back, but it's not going to happen as long as the Austrians are around. So the Austrians are a natural enemy for the Italians, and the French are also not on friendly terms with the Italians, because in the competition for colonies, particularly in Tunisia, the Italians coming out of Libya and the French coming out of Morocco are running into each other. And of course, they're both Mediterranean powers and interested in dominating Mediterranean politics. And so there's political rivalry that hasn't broken out into war between the French and the Italians as well. And so they're trying to break into the Western European political scene, but they are weak militarily, they are weak economically, they are divided politically between factions that are royalists who want more power for the Italian king, and factions that are Republicans and want to move more, even more aggressively to a pure democracy. And then you have the secularists who are anti-religion, and you have those loyal to the papacy who would like to see a restored, strengthened Italian pope. And so internally, politics are in turmoil. It's the least industrial of the Western European states. The various parts of the country have not unified culturally. Northern Italians kind of associate themselves with either France or Germany. Most of the industry in Italy is in the north. The northern population has begun to industrialize and is much better educated. Most of southern Italy is illiterate and poor and works the land such as it is. But the land in southern Italy is not that fertile. And one of the things that's happening around the turn of the century is Italy's losing about 10,000 males per month immigrating, most of them to North America. And they're coming from the southern parts of the country. And linguistically, you would think, okay, the Italians, well, they all speak Italian, except that linguistically, Italy is as diverse, and the Italian language in its various dialects are as diverse as any language in the world. And many of the dialects spoken in the boot can't be understood by Northern Italians who speak kind of the high Italian. And so there is not a lot unifying this country. And against that backdrop, in 1882, you have the Italians sign a treaty with Austria and Hungary, or I'm sorry, Austria and Germany, which proves to be somewhat controversial. That treaty really doesn't have an effect on relations until 1914, and that treaty is called the Triple Alliance. The treaty was not popular with the Italian people, those that were interested in politics, because it's with the Austro-Hungarians, who are one of their rival nations, and so generally the government signs the treaty, but the people, the general population of Italy, either they don't care or they're hostile to the treaty. What the treaty, though, says is that the Italians, the Austrians, and the Germans are going to work together against their rivals. In the case of Italy, the rival country is France. And the French share a border with Italy. They back to the Kingdom of Sardinia. Much of what was the Kingdom of Sardinia becomes part of France, And the French have designs on gaining the rest of the Piedmont area of northern Italy into incorporating it into Greater France. And so the Italians are wary of the French, and as I said, they're competing with the French in the Mediterranean for colonies and political power. So the agreement says that if France attacks Germany, then the Italians will support Germany. If France attacks Italy, which the Italians considered a viable option, then Germany will support France, or I'm sorry, will support Italy. The Austrians are concerned not about the Italians attacking them or about the French, but they're concerned about the Russians. And so their part of the treaty is if the Austrians are attacked by Russia, Italy agrees to stay neutral. That would allow Austria to concentrate on Russia. If Italy was to somehow ally with Russia, then Austria would be forced to fight a two-front war. And so it's really, Italy doesn't have a lot of interest in a treaty with Austria, but Austria and Germany come to Italy as a package deal. And so they're willing to agree to neutrality with Austria in order to gain security from German support against France. And so that's the setup of the treaty. Then in 1914, World War I happens. Italy has a treaty that it had made some years prior to World War I with France, but it was basically a treaty that said that the two countries would not attack each other. And so now you have Germany attacking France. Where does that put Italy in 1914? It basically puts them in the middle. Italy initially declares neutrality because it points to the Triple Alliance Treaty and says, hey, France didn't attack Germany, so we don't have an obligation to support Germany. Germany started the war. So, you know, read the fine print. We don't have to support you. Austria and Germany initiate the war against Russia. Again, there's no requirement for Italy to step into the war. And so in 1914, as the rest of Europe goes to war, Italy decides to remain neutral, except that it's a conditional neutrality. Italy is going to remain neutral until it decides which side it should ally with, which side offers the best deal. And so it enters into negotiations with both Germany and with France and Great Britain regarding what Italy will get out of the war if it allies with you and you win. And both sides promise Italy big chunks of the other guy's land. So Germany basically says, hey, we will give you parts of what is today southern France, what was part of the old Sardinian Kingdom of Sardinia, and Austria says, you know, if you're in it with us, we'll also give you access into the Balkans and the what has always been a goal of the Italian nationalists is the city of Trieste. The British and the Germans, or correction, the British and the French say, well, we'll give you Trieste as well, but we will also give you all of southern Austria, the South Tyrol Alps. And so those are the enticements. Italy watches the war progress. The Schlieffen Plan fails in 1914. Germany doesn't achieve a quick victory. Trench warfare sets in on the Western Front, and the Italian politicians basically make an assessment that the Allies have the advantage, and the Allies offer the best opportunity for Italy's interests. And part of this is you got to look at Italy in the Mediterranean. If it allies with the Germans and the Austrians, all of a sudden the British Navy operating in the Mediterranean, the French Navy operating in the Mediterranean, and all of the peninsula is a potential invasion area for the Allies. And just defending Italy is going to be a huge, huge military problem if they're on the side of the Germans. If they're on the side of the French and the British, the military problem is much simpler. This is the military problem, okay? The Italians come in on the side of the Germans, or on the side of the British and the French, and you can see the Italian front. The Italian front is in that little yellow box. That's the border that Italy shares with the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It's 460 miles long. That will be the theater of operations. If they are part of the Axis powers, Austro-Hungary and Germany, then they've got all of Italy potentially as a theater of operations, as the British and French navies can threaten any of the coast of Italy. So the military situation really kind of tips the balance in favor of, hey, be a lot easier if we're on the Allies' side. The guy who runs the Italian army is this guy, Luigi Cardona. He'd been in the army over 40 years, getting ready to retire in 1915. He's the commander-in-chief of the Italian army. Excuse me. He is not a nice guy. He's known as insubordinate, doesn't like to take orders, from politicians or from other generals. He's been a general a long time. He makes general in the 1890s. By the time of World War I, he'd been a general for over 20 years, been in the army for over 40 years. He's the son of a general. He's a Piedmont. He's from the Piedmont region. He is his family is a prominent family in was a prominent family in the Kingdom of Sardinia and is still a prominent family in Italy. He's politically connected, and he doesn't tolerate dissension. Doesn't want to hear anybody disagreeing with his plans. Subordinates are afraid of him. In the course of the war, well, the 2 years of the war that he's in charge, from May of 1915 to October of 1917, he relieves over 200 generals and over 300 colonels. Not a great guy to work for. But as Italy enters the war. So his plan, as he looks at the military situation, is to move the entire Italian army up into that box you see there along the 400-mile border with Austro-Hungary. But that 400-mile border really isn't a 400-mile military theater, because probably the entire border is designed to follow the line of the Southern Alps. And so there are no large areas where you can deploy significant numbers of forces, and basically you're fighting from alpine mountaintop to alpine mountaintop in almost all areas, and the exception is in the upper right corner where Italy borders on the Austro-Hungarian province of Slovenia. And what Cardora's plan is that the Italian army is going to attack across that border to Ljubljana, the capital of Slovenia, and then there's a maneuver corridor where the army can pivot to the north and attack north into Austria property and threaten Vienna. And he sees this as a few weeks operation that will quickly and knock Austro-Hungary out of the war, and lead to victory parades for the Italian army, high-fiving in Rome somewhere. And that's his plan. The problem is it doesn't work. This is the area that we're talking about, seen a little bit differently. The border, the international border between Austria and Italy, is in the red dotted line. The rest of it is the Venetian Plain, which is crossed by numerous rivers. You see the rivers going north to south, coming out of the mountains into the Adriatic. The Venetian Plain is an area where you can maneuver large military forces, but it's still difficult because of the north-south rivers. The mountains themselves are almost impassable, and I'll show you some pictures of them. And so the idea is Italy controls everything south of the border when the war starts. The Italian army moves into that area, and they move up to the border with Slovenia, which is the Isonzo River there on the right side of the screen. And for the first 2 years, this is where the war is fought. There are forces deployed all along that border in those mountains, but they're basically just looking at each other, artillery attacks and some local attacks, but nobody is doing anything serious militarily in the Alps. And so the only opportunity is to break through there in northeast Italy, across the Isonzo River, and then into Slovenia, attack into Slovenia where the mountains are not as severe, and then basically you're going to flank the Alps and then move north into Austria. And so that's his plan. And you can see, basically looking at the geography, that that's the only plan that has any chance of working. Of course, the Austrians know that too. And so most of the more than 50 divisions that the Austrians have are positioned there along the Isonzo River, and most of the Italian divisions also positioned there. And this gives you an idea of what the terrain looks like from the military positions in the rest of the theater. Okay, so you have about 300 miles of this, and then not to belabor the point, but the Isonzo area, although it's comparatively flat, really isn't flat. It's just not Alps, and so compared to this type of mountainous terrain, the low mountains along the Isonzo River offer some hope of military accomplishment. And so from June 1915 to June 1917, the Italian army is on the offensive for 2 years, okay? And what it's trying to do is cross that one river and penetrate into the plains on the other side of the river with the objective of the Slovenian capital. For 2 years, they do this. Now, on the big map there, what you see, immediately when the war starts, the Italian army takes the offensive and they move a few miles, occupy any areas where the Austrians aren't strong. So those blue areas are gained in the first month or two of the war. Over here on the right, I'll blow that up a little bit, what you see outlined in this little red pocket on the bottom right is the 13 miles or so that the Italian army gains over the next 2 years. 11 battles of the Isonzo River over a period of 2 years cost the Italian army 645,000 casualties to go 13 miles. The Austrians pay 450,000 casualties. By June of 1917, now for the Allies, the big war has been going on for 3 years. The Italians have been in it for 2 years, and this is what they've got. People of Italy are not very happy because when you look at it, this is a war of choice for the Italians. Nobody attacked Italy. The Italians weren't defending Italy from an aggressive Austro-Hungary. They had a treaty with them. They weren't defending Italy from the Germans. So the Italian people are like, tell me again why we're fighting, and oh, by the way, how come we're not winning? Of course, this is the army that in its only 2 major battles before World War I got beat, and got beat bad by the Ethiopians. So, in the big scheme of things, they're not well regarded by by most of everybody in Italy, including their own soldiers. Desertion rates are incredibly high in the Italian army. People are trying to avoid the draft. I often wonder why my grandfather went back to Italy to join the army, and I think it's because he hadn't had his U.S. citizenship yet. And if he didn't show up for the draft, he would become a criminal, and that would affect him getting his U.S. citizenship later. So he didn't really have a choice if he wanted to keep his options of immigrating to America open, so he had to go back for the draft. But this is what's going on for the first 2 years of the war. And it looks like this would be really bad, except this is what's happening all over the Western Front. The British and the French, with much bigger and much more professional armies, are not doing much better. Then in October 24th, 1917, the Austro-Hungarians launched a surprise attack. This is called the Battle of Caporetto. And in basically 4 days, they destroy an entire Italian army and push the Italians back to the Piave River, which is basically within 25 or so miles of Venice. And so 60-mile advance by the Austrians in 4 days, an unprecedented victory. Nobody in World War I, since the Schlieffen Plan, which opened the war, had gained this much territory this fast. The Italian army suffers 445,000 casualties, but 250,000 surrender. The Germans proceed their attack with chlorine gas attack. There's a snowstorm in the area for 2 days. The artillery gas shells are launched in a snowy, drizzly rain. The Italians don't even know that they've been hit by gas. Hundreds of Italian troops die from asphyxiation, manning their positions, not even knowing that they're under a gas attack, never putting on their gas masks. The reason 250,000 of them surrender, though, is because Italian gas masks are only rated to last, to perform effectively for 1 to 2 hours. And so, and most of the troops had never trained by putting them on. It's the first time gas is used in large numbers on the Italian front. And at the same time, the Germans have moved 14 divisions in to reinforce the Austrians, and they are elite German stormtroop divisions. And the Germans use this offensive to practice their new stormtroop tactics, is where the Germans will infiltrate past the frontline positions to destroy headquarters and artillery positions in the rear area. So those Italian troops who survive the gas attacks and the artillery barrages that begin the offensive find out that when they ring up on their wire telephones to their headquarters, nobody answers. And nobody answers their calls for artillery. The Italian artillery fire no rounds back at the Austrians for the first 24 hours of the battle. And essentially the Italian army is overrun. Crisis, not just in Italy, but also among the Allies. The French and the British are like, oh, geez, the Italians could be out of this war. And so the French and the British send reinforcements as fast as they can from France. 5 British divisions, 2 French divisions, and even an American Army regiment are sent to back up the Italian army. The Italian king, Emmanuel III, has an emergency meeting. His chief of the army, General Cordova, decides not to show up. The king finally is upset, I should say, to put it mildly, and fires Cordova, and he hires a new commander. The new commander is this guy, Marshal Armando Diaz. And unlike Cordova, Marshal Armando Diaz starts out the war as a 1-star general, commands a division for the first year of the war, commands a corps for the second year of the war, is very closely associated with the fighting along the Arzanzo River, and his division and his corps are part of the more successful parts of the Italian army, and so he is elevated from corps command to be the chief of staff of the Italian army, and he immediately makes changes in how the army fights. Before that happens, the Italian army fights a battle at Monte Grappa, which is along the Piave River. You can see I've circled it there on the map. That's what the mountain looks like. From the top of that mountain, you can see to Venice. And the Italians hold this mountain. The Austrians are running out of supplies because they didn't expect to move as far and as fast as they did. The Italians destroy a lot of the bridges as they're retreating, so the Austrians are having trouble supplying their troops, and they're unable, in a month-long battle in November or December 1917, unable to take this hill, which allows the Italians to stabilize their line, where you see it drawn here on the map, which is along also the Piave River. This gives you an idea of what the terrain looks like in the mountains, and this left picture is a position on Monte Grappa, an Italian position. Impossible to dig trenches in granite in the Alps, and so the defenses that they rely upon are fortresses. They're not ideal. They can be knocked down by artillery fire if you can get the artillery in a position to hit them, but they're built into the side of the mountains. Bottom right picture, that's one of the fortresses built, Italian fortresses to defend the Alps, and they had to build fortresses because they couldn't dig into the ground. So you're back to basically making castles. And they were somewhat protected from artillery fire because it's very difficult in the Alps to get guns in position where they could bombard these positions. So Armando Diaz takes over the army. Very different personality, still a disciplinarian, but also very open-minded, considered one of the smartest guys in the Italian army, concerned about his troops. Visits the troops at the front lines, has been with the troops on the front lines in his previous commands for 2 years, and also is a student of tactics. And he understands how to defeat the stormtroop tactics, and he builds a defensive line along the Piave River, which is in depth, and which has mobile reserves and very flexible. And so in June, when the Austrians attack again, trying to complete the destruction of the Italian army, they run into a completely different army with a completely new sense of leadership. And Diaz has used those 6 months since the catastrophe and the defeat of the destruction of the Italian Second Army to revitalize the army. Ironically, up until the defeat, the Italian people really didn't have skin in the game in World War I. I mean, they were losing a lot of guys, but they didn't really understand and rally behind a reason to fight. But having been defeated, and more importantly, having the Austrian army now in Italy on the offensive, rallies the Italian people to the war for the first time. In the summer of 1918. And so in the summer of 1918, the Austrians try to renew the offensive. German troops have been pulled out of the theater, and so the Austrian army isn't as strong. The Italian army is revitalized, and the attempt to cross the Piave River fail miserably, and you can see the casualty numbers there. The Austrians already weakened army, weakened by losses that they took over the winter, weakened by the Germans pulling back their forces, is weakened even further. The Allies want Diaz to immediately begin counterattacking against the Austrians, but he refuses. He stands up to the French and British commanders who are pushing him to attack in the summer of 1918. He says the Italian army still isn't ready, continues to reinforce his army and train, and then finally takes the offensive exactly 1 year after their major defeat on October 24th, 1918. They launch an attack against the Austro-Hungarians. And the blue shows you the rapid advance of the Italian army back to its original positions. And it's not so much the ground that they gained this ground in about 4 days. It's not so much the ground they gain, but as they attack, the Austro-Hungarian army disintegrates. It's not like where the Italians were defeated and the Italians retreated back. Here, the Austrian army basically falls apart. As this attack happens and the Italians achieve a breakthrough, the Czech province of the Austro-Hungarian Empire declares its independence. Hungary breaks away. Hungary is 50% of the empire, at least politically. They break away from the empire and they declare themselves independent of Austria and ready to sue for peace. And as they do, their military units, which are integrated into the Austrian army, they stop fighting. And so as the Italians approach the border of Slovenia, it's not that the Austrians are being pushed back. The Austrians don't exist. You can see in the statistics there, 450,000 POWs. Now, the Italians lost 250,000 POWs. This is twice the number, and the Austrian army is not as robust, and it doesn't have allies to back it up like England and France as they backed up the Italians during their defeat the previous year. And so what ends up happening is the Austrians go on the 4th of November, said, we're out of the war. And they begin negotiating for an armistice, or they negotiate an armistice on the 4th of November. Now, remember, Germany doesn't begin negotiating for an armistice until the 11th of November. So this is 7 days before the Germans. And Austria is knocked out of the war by Italy. There are no Allied units in this offensive. The British and French divisions that are there in Italy, but they are in reserve. They don't participate in the attack. It's a purely Italian attack, very successful, and it basically knocks Austria out of the war. So that ends the war. Again, some pictures to give you an idea of the type of terrain that they're fighting in here in northern Italy. On the 11th of November, the Germans sue for peace and sign an armistice with the Allies, so 1 week later. And I'll come back to that point. Here you see General, at this time, Field Marshal Diaz. He's second from the left, with General Pershing, General Foch, the leader of the Belgian army and the leader of the British Navy. And this picture was taken here in Kansas City in 1921 at the groundbreaking for the World War I Museum and Memorial. So General Diaz, recognized by the Allies as a very effective leader, and really in Italian military history, probably the most effective military leader that the country of Italy, whether it's the kingdom or the modern Italy of post-World War II, has ever produced. Here's what it cost the Italians: 651,000 killed in action and another almost 1 million wounded. And you can compare that to the losses from the other Allies. Obviously, France and England in the war longer than the Italians and fighting a much more difficult enemy on a much more strategically decisive front, suffered more, but significantly more casualties than the U.S. suffered in World War I. And then here's some questions to think about as you look at Italy's participation in World War I. Italy had a choice of which side to be on. The war was a very close-run thing, particularly on the Western Front, not decided until the fall of 1918. What if Italy and its almost 60 divisions had joined with the Germans? That would have not only freed up potentially the 60 Italian divisions, but the almost 60 Austrian divisions that were deployed against the Italians would also have been free to be used elsewhere in the front. So you're talking about 2 or 3 million man manpower pool, military manpower pool that would have been available in 1915 to the Germans and the Austrians had Italy chosen differently. So what if Italy had collapsed and the Italian army had been routed and internally collapsed like the Austrian army did a year later, and the Austrians had, the Italians had surrendered separately to Italy, that would have put those 60 Austrian divisions on the French border in the fall of 1918 and opened up potentially the resources of Italy to use by the Germans. And then finally, I would argue that one of the reasons the Germans seek an armistice a week after the Italian victory is not, if you read the Western histories, the French, the British, and the American, it's because the Allied armies had begun the Meuse-Argonne offensive in September of 1918 and were steadily moving towards the German border. But I would argue that when Austria collapses and the Italian army now is just a march away from southern Germany, that's the strategic calculus, or a big part of the strategic calculus. Yeah, the Germans would have lost to the French, the British, and the Americans eventually, but probably before that would have happened, the Italian army would have been in Bavaria. And so I think, the reason the war ends on the 11th of November, 1918, is not because of what's going on the Western Front, but it's because of what happens here in Italy. A couple other little notes there at the bottom. After World War I, Italy, the modern Italy, finally has this sense of Italian identity. The war is what unites the country, such as it is. Even today, Italy is not the most homogeneous, united, everybody loves each other country, but it's way better than it was before World War I, and the modern Italy really can track its history from the unifying effects of World War I. And then finally, the map of modern Italy, which includes Trieste, is the map that they go to war with in World War II, and is really the post-war map, and is the map that we live with today, is created by the Italian victory in World War I. And so, Italy in World War I, entertain your questions. Sure.
Thank you very much for this. I'll also say I also have parts of my family on the Italian and the Austrian side during the war, so it's always good to. As a corollary to, certainly your last point I think makes a ton of sense. I think I read that with the Armistice of Villa Giusti on the 3rd, the Austrian government, such as it was at that point, allowed for free passage of Allied forces through their territory. Would you say that Vittorio Veneto would have been possible had the Austro-Hungarian Empire not been in complete disintegration at that point?
It's a good question. I think the offensive would have been successful, probably right up until it hit the river line, the Azoro River line, and then you would have been back to where we were in from 1915 to 1917. The fact is, when they get to there's no Austrian army left. And so I think militarily it would have been probably as successful because Diaz had rejuvenated the Italian army, and but I also and the terrain supported them, and the even if politically they hadn't been disrupted, the Austro-Hungarian army in Italy itself was logistically and militarily, in terms of leadership, not up to the caliber that the Italians were in the summer of 1918 or in the fall of 1918. And so it would have been a victory, but the strategic implications would not, there wouldn't have been a walk through Slovenia to Vienna, which is what potentially would have happened had the war continued. And so, yes, strategically, the implications wouldn't have been as significant, but tactically, I think we would have had a similar result. Any other questions?
At the time of World War I that it began, were there any significant separatist movements inside Italy? And if so, how did the war affect them?
There were always separatist movements inside Italy, and but the government was strong enough, internal security measures were also strong enough, and that they didn't have a significant impact on the war effort. And so, yeah, I think the separate, well, you know, the internal political divisions within Italy were significant, but they didn't manifest themselves in a way that had an effect on either the war effort or writ large on the Italian army. Now, inside the Italian army was never really, Italian soldiers were never really satisfied about why they were at war, how the government treated them, and even the officer corps was not a nationalistic force for the war effort. There were too many ethnic divisions within the country, between the different regions in Italy, too many political divisions, and then big class divisions between the ruling class who ran the Italian government and the 80% of the population who were basically the peasants or poor industrial workers. And that condition predated the war and didn't change during the war. If anything, it got worse. Italy goes into huge debt because most of the military supplies, if you look at the Italian uniforms, they're French helmets. Most of the military supplies are coming from the Allies because the Italian economy couldn't support a million-man army, and the munitions required to execute the type of operations that they were doing in World War I.
Our last question will be from the other side of the room.
Sir.
What would you say was the effect of the Army's experience in regards to the rise of fascism post-war?
So Italy, internally, you have, it facilitates the rise of the Italian right. Mussolini is himself a soldier in World War I. The fascists used the World War I experience as an example of the potential for Italy, and then as other political, particularly the socialists, which are the largest opposition to the fascists in the 1920s, as they opposed the fascists, the fascist propaganda tries to paint the opposition as unpatriotic, not having supported the war, and Mussolini co-ops like all the positive symbols of the war. The Italian General Diaz is appointed by Mussolini to be the Minister of War, is promoted to Marshal of Italy, and so fascist propaganda takes advantage of how the war ended positively and becomes basically the owners of that version of World War I, and then blames things like the defeat in 1917 on anybody who is unpatriotic, anybody who opposes the fascists are unpatriotic, they are spoilers, and they are one of the reasons why we were so close to defeat in 1917. And it's only, kind of the patriotic spirit which the fascists kind of take ownership for that brings victory. And so the World War I experience, the positive part of it, is co-opted by the fascists and becomes part of the fascist propaganda myth, which is, we are as good as any other European country and potentially great. And they basically used the 1920s and 30s as they build power in Italy. They use the history of World War I and even the prior history in Ethiopia, where the Italians were unsuccessful, as evidence of failure when you are not, patriotically in step with the fascists. And so that's, it becomes a great propaganda tool for them especially in the 1920s.
So would you say that the fascists had a lot to do with the creation of modern Italian identity?
Well, yeah, because even today, you go to Italy and there are people who've got Mussolini up on the walls of their houses, and you go into a barber shop and there'll be a guy there's got Mussolini hanging up because those were the good days when the trains ran on time. Now, most of that is a myth, but it's the power of propaganda and the Italian right, which when after World War II the Italian population rejects the monarchy and Italy becomes a pure republic, the Italian right, who had been divided between the fascists and the royalists, now have nowhere else to go. And some of them, to this day, see those years after World War I, when Italy was part of the winning side, as the good old years. And so there's, I won't say it's a strong movement in Italy, but it's visible. I've seen it. I mentioned I've been in a barber shop in Italy, and there's Mussolini up on the wall. And I have a cousin Italian cousin who, if you read his webpage, you wonder if you're not back in 1928 or 1932, because the power of the myth of Italian glory in World War I, inherited then by the fascists, and they kind of just ignore all that. We didn't do so well in World War II, and kind of were allied with the Nazis and stuff. That part is kind of just ignored. So, thank you for your attention. I really enjoyed talking to you. I hope you got something out of it. I think it's a underappreciated aspect of World War I, and that as you look back at World War I histories now, maybe you look at it a little bit different. It isn't all about the Western Front and the British and French, although that certainly was the decisive theater. It's not the only story to come out of World War I. So thank you.
Thank you.